In this video, I'm going to talk about page 8 to 11 of your book and its beta calls. If you've already watched my previous videos, you know that these two items will be things that I'll cover in the following parts. I'll explain the difficult vocabulary, and then I'll explain the plot and the characters. So let's start. If you remember from the previous pages, like page 4 to 7, then we learned that Gerald and Sheila were officially engaged. And now Sheila and Mrs. Birling left the dining room, leaving Eric as well, leaving Mr. Birling and Gerald in the room talking. So this is the beginning of page 8. They started to talk. So let's take a look at these vocabulary. In this part, there are a little bit more words that I would like to explain. So let's take a look. The first one is decanter. Decanter. It is a glass container. So people will pour red wine inside to let the wine breathe. Because if you don't let the wine breathe, it won't taste good. So if you want to drink red wine, one of the steps would be pouring the red wine into a decanter to let it breathe, so that it will be more tasty. And then the second word would be cigar. Cigar. Actually, it's just like cigarette. It has tobacco leaves rolled with the paper, and it's for smoking. But normally, only rich people would afford good cigar. So now Mr. Birling is offering Gerald cigar to smoke, is to show off his identity, his social status, and also his wealth. A third word is confidentially. Confidentially. It means sort of like secretly. Trying to keep it confidential, low profile, secretly. Then the fourth word, murmur. Murmur means not speaking clearly and quietly. The fifth word, dissent. Dissent means objection, like disagreement. So when Gerald tries to murmur some dissent, it means he actually disagreed with Mr. Birling, but because he was kind of embarrassed. When Mr. Birling mentioned that Gerald's mother didn't want Gerald to marry Sheila, so Gerald was kind of embarrassed, and so he didn't speak so clearly, but he murmured some dissent, speaking very unclearly. And then the sixth word, Mr. Birling checks him. Checks here means stop him. The seventh word, landed people, the phrase, okay, landed people. It refers to people who own a lot of land, so they must be very rich. It is used to describe Miss Lady Croft, Gerald's mom. So we can see that Gerald's mom is a very rich person. And the last one, knighthood. Knighthood is an honorary title given by the government or the royal family to reward those who serve the country or the city, the government, the town, and the royal family. Knighthood. So now let me explain a little bit of the content in this part. So from Mr. Birling's speech, we've learned that Gerald's mother, Lady Croft, even though she didn't object Gerald marrying Sheila, actually, she felt that Gerald could have done better for himself socially. This speech clearly implied that Lady Croft actually didn't want Gerald to marry Sheila because of the social class. And so from this speech, we actually know that two families were from different social classes again. Remember, Gerald's family, they're in the upper class, while Mr. Birling's family is in the middle class. So to Lady Croft, Gerald shouldn't marry someone of a lower class. That's why Lady Croft didn't really like the idea of Gerald marrying Sheila, and that's why both Sir George Croft and Lady Croft, they didn't appear in this engagement dinner. So we can also tell that this marriage, even as a business marriage, is not really proposed by the Croft family. Obviously, it's initiated by the Birling family and agreed by Gerald himself. So what could Gerald earn if she married Sheila? Then Mr. Birling continued his speech. He said he could understand why Lady Croft reacted like that, because she was landed people, meaning that Lady Croft was really rich and upper class. And then Mr. Birling tried to reveal his little secret, that he's going to receive a knighthood. So once he received a knighthood, he will no longer just be a middle-class family or businessman anymore. So Mr. Birling tried to tell Gerald this because he wanted Gerald to let his family know that sooner or later, the Birling family would become an upper-class family, so that the Croft family shouldn't look down on the Birling family anymore. So this is the purpose of Mr. Birling telling Gerald about his knighthood. In this part, there are several words I want you to pay attention to. Number 1, Lord Mayor. Lord Mayor. Lord Mayor basically is the official in charge of a town or city. And then the second one, a sound, useful party man. So here, Mr. Birling was trying to explain that he was a trustable, a very stable, a very practical businessman. So sound means trustable, useful. And then the third word, scandal. Scandal means rumor of some wrongdoing, like if this family has done something bad or wrong and they are famous and then their wrongdoing is reported by the news, then this is a scandal. Scandal can be rumor, can be fake, but definitely it would affect the reputation of someone. So it's called a scandal, something bad and negative. The next word, complacently. Complacently. It simply means confidently, that someone is showing satisfaction, very content. That is complacently. Next, obstacle. Obstacle. Obstacle is like barriers, something that block you from doing your work or going on your way. So it's like something to stop you from doing something, an obstacle. And then the last one, delighted. Delighted. I think it's pretty easy to most of you. It means happy. Happy. So Gerald said if Lady Croft knew about the knighthood thing, then she would be delighted. She'd be happy. So after Gerald learned that Mr. Birling was going to receive his knighthood, he offered his congratulations. However, Mr. Birling asked Gerald not to say anything to many others, but only to give some hint to his family about his knighthood. He explained how he probably would get this knighthood, mainly because he served the government, the royalty, and he served his town and city, so very likely he would receive his knighthood, as long as there is no scandal and they behave properly. But if you have already read the book, then you would know that it is an irony, because basically the whole family was involved in a very big scandal. So when he said, well, as long as we're not going to get into a scandal, then I would receive the knighthood, this is definitely an irony. When Gerald said, you seem to be a nice, well-behaved family, is it real? Obviously, Gerald didn't know the Birling family that well actually. When you know what was going to happen after the inspector arrived. So at this moment, to Gerald, he thought that there was no obstacle for Mr. Birling to become a knighthood, so he should still congratulate him. But Mr. Birling insisted to ask Gerald to keep the whole thing low profile, to keep it as a secret first and not to tell anyone. Think about it. Mr. Birling was a person who liked to show off and brag about himself. Then why this knighthood thing, he needed to ask Gerald to keep it low profile? How high is the chance that Mr. Birling would really receive this knighthood? What do you think? If he was sort of like 100% sure, Would he brag about it? Would he ask Gerald to keep it low profile? Very likely not, right? If he was so sure about the knighthood. So maybe Mr. Birling wasn't so sure about the knighthood, and he tried to say this only to let Gerald let his parents know that they were actually not that bad, like a middle class family, and they would have a chance to move to the upper class. That was probably the only reason why he would tell Gerald about it. You can see that at the last sentence, Mr. Birling was asking Gerald to drop a hint to Lady Croft only. So we can see that Mr. Birling was just trying to please Gerald's parent with this news. Let's continue and take a look at these words. The first word, potty. It means people are crazy and silly. So Eric was saying that women were crazy about fashion, about clothes. So he used the word potty. And the second word, checks. Eric checks himself. We actually have seen this word like 2 slides before. It means stop. He stops himself from talking. And then the third word, eagerly. It means desperately. He really want to say something eagerly. The fourth word, amused. It simply means excited. The last word, fishy. So something suspicious. So seemed like Eric was hiding some secret and Gerald was really excited and wanted to learn about it. So there was the word amused and fishy. Fishy means suspicious. In the middle of Mr. Birling and Gerald's conversation, Eric entered. And this part is mainly about Eric. We can learn a lot more about Eric in this part. First, when Eric sat down, he took the decanter and helped himself for more wine. You could see that he was actually very skillful. So he definitely had the habit of drinking a lot. And Eric brought up the issue that Mrs. Birling and Sheila were talking about clothes and saying that women were crazy about it. So Mr. Birling replied saying that he understood why women were so crazy about clothes, and and that was based on his experience and his age, definitely, because he was old enough and experienced enough to learn about women. And Mr. Birling said that it was actually a token of their self-respect. It actually implies that women at that time counted a lot on how they dressed themselves. It was sort of like a self-identity. Of course, only the middle-class people or the upper-class women could afford beautiful dresses. So it was sort of like a self-identity. How you dressed and what kind of clothes you actually wore represented your social class. And Gerald replied, "That's true." So he sort of understood women as well. And Eric eagerly tried to say, "Oh yes, I remember," but he suddenly stopped. This is actually pretty strange because Mr. Birling was old enough, Gerald was old enough to understand women, but Eric was actually pretty young. And to Mr. Birling and Gerald, Eric shouldn't have a lot of experience in relationship with women actually. But from this sentence, we already learned that Eric actually had some experience with women. And Eric stopped himself from talking. And by this action, we could learn that he actually had some secrets kept to himself. And when Mr. Birling tried to ask him what did he remember, and he refused to say anything and just said nothing. And Gerald found that it was actually a little bit fishy, meaning that a little bit suspicious. So Gerald was aware that Eric was keeping secrets away from them. And then Mr. Birling continued. In this part, there are only like few words I want you to pay attention to. Number 1, short of cash. Mr. Birling was saying that when he was young, his parents would not give him so much money. So short of cash means very little of cash, very little of money. Broke out, the second one, broke out. It means escaped. So Mr. Birling still found a way to escape and had some fun, even he has so little money. So broke out means escape. Number 3, solemnly. It means seriously. Mr. Birling was presenting his speech seriously. And then the last word, cranks. It refers to people who have very strange and unusual ideas. So here to Mr. Birling, cranks were the one who did not think like him. Like when he said that people should care about his own family, look after your own family, then some people, those cranks that he refers to, should take care of everybody else in the society. So to Mr. Birling, these cranks actually held different opinions. So yeah, cranks mean people who have strange and unusual ideas, normally opposite to what you know. So when Eric was trying to hide his secret, Mr. Birling continued his speech, saying that how hard he worked when he was young and how little money he would get from work or from his family, and even with very little money he would still escape and had some fun by that time. That was the teenage time of Mr. Birling, and he was trying to compare his own to how Gerald and Eric lived at that time. It's mainly the difference between the elderly and the young ones. And you could see that Gerald tried to please Mr. Birling again, saying that, oh, I bet you did, showing his understanding and agreement. Basically, anything Mr. Birling said, Gerald would agree. And then Mr. Birling continued his speech. There were like 3 important ideas in this part of speech. First, Mr. Birling said that people should actually mind their own businesses. Number 2, everyone should look after themselves and their own family only. And when people at that time asked everyone to look after everyone, to Mr. Birling it was actually nonsense. So you can see that Mr. Birling was a very strong capitalist, believing that his own money is his own and he only cares about his business and money, and how hard he worked, it was only for his own family and he shouldn't care about the society, about the community. So it's a totally opposite idea to socialist. So those cranks that Mr. Birling referred to were definitely socialist, supporting people to look after the whole society and community. So remember, Mr. Birling is actually a capitalist. And remember, why would the author J.B. Priestley write a character like this? J.B. Priestley was trying to show the dark side, the ugly side of some capitalists who only cared about himself and about money, about their own businesses, and about their social class and reputation. So J.B. Priestley was really upset about this, so he would create Mr. Birling as such character to remind his readers about the bad side, the dark side, the bad thing about capitalism. So the very last part, let's take a look at these 2 words and one phrase and one word. The first one, piled it on. It means someone is being very serious and is talking too much, saying too much. So Eric was referring Mr. Birling that he has piled it on, meaning that Mr. Birling has said too much and he was too serious. Okay, the next word, Mr. Birling explained that he talked too much because he was contented. It means he was satisfied. Then in this part we learned that Inspector Gould arrived. And Edna showed up again. Edna was the house helper, the housemaid, who answered the door. While Mr. Birling asked Eric and Gerald to continue to have some more wine and continue to talk. And Eric said, Mr. Birling has talked too much already, and Mr. Birling explained that he was very happy that day, and to just show his experience because he was old enough and experienced enough to give advice. At that point, Edna entered the scene, explaining that an inspector arrived, and that was a police inspector, Inspector Gould. And Mr. Birling asked Edna if it was an important issue, and Edna said yes. And so Mr. Birling asked Edna to show Inspector Gould to the room and to give them some more light. Basically, Mr. Birling was asking Edna to light up the room a little bit. So this part mainly introduced Inspector Gould to the scene. So the very last part, several words that I want you to pay attention to. Number one, on the bench. So here, bench is not like the chair, but it means like to serve as a local magistrate. So it's like working for the lower court. And so Mr. Birling thought that Inspector Gould arrived probably because he was still working at the lower court, and so the police inspector came to find him for a warrant. A warrant is a legal document, is an official document to give the police authority to arrest someone or to search someone's place. So basically, it's just an official document to give police authority to take action. So this is warrant. And third word, we learned about it already, uneasy. It means not feeling so comfortable. So Eric was not so comfortable when Gerald and Mr. Birling were joking about him. Then last word, defiantly. It means he's being very disobedient, very challenging, try to challenge back. So when Mr. Birling asked Eric, what's the matter with you? And Eric was actually kind of being challenged, and he was kind of rude and replied nothing, okay, being a little bit mad and disobedient. So remember when Mr. Birling told Gerald about his knighthood, he said as long as there was no scandal, then he would probably receive the knighthood. And here the inspector arrived, so Gerald joked about it, saying that, oh, unless Eric did something wrong, then. And actually Eric didn't know what they were talking about, so Eric was really serious about it. So asked Gerald what he meant about doing something wrong. Even Gerald explained that it was just a joke, and Eric still felt very uncomfortable and thought that it wasn't funny. So you can see that Gerald and Mr. Birling really thought that it was only a joke. But how did Eric react? I think he was a little bit overreacted, right? So what does it mean if he was that overreacted when people were just joking about it? So he was taken very seriously. Very likely he did something bad and he really had a scandal. So that was the secret that he kept to himself, while at that point Mr. Birling and Gerald or the rest of the family still didn't know. We will find out the secret of Eric later on, okay? So that's the end of this part. I hope you understand these characters a little bit more. And the inspector has arrived, so we're going into the real story now.